right. Well, hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well tonight. Oh, that's loud. So married to my wife, actually. We've been married 22 years. That's glad that I'm married to her. And we've got 4 children, ages 18 all the way down to 10, actually. And a lot of the things that I do every day in teaching apologetics, I'm seeing real-time connections with my kids right now who are in the schools. And, my son has got some students on the soccer team that he's been living his life in front of and been pretty vocal about his faith. And it's been fun to watch him. Actually, his best friend just led to the Lord. And a lot of the conversations were, Dad, what do you think about this? How do you explain, why Jesus is God? And what do we think about the Bible? And so it's been really fun to kind of see, even in my kids, just how relevant this stuff is. And my daughter, who's a sophomore, came home one day. She's like, Dad, what am I supposed to think about homosexuality? It's like this huge question that our culture's asking. And so we talked about it, but it just spurred me on. You know what? I think I'll add a few books in one of my classes, and because I want to learn this for my kids. And so I'm really excited to be here with you, and I love that you guys are taking some time to talk about apologetics. I think it's super important, and I do come to, I love to study these things, but I come to you as someone who's been on the campus for, the last 17 years, just in the trenches, just trying to share the gospel, and these questions come up all the time. And so that's really what I want to do. So I'll take about half of my time to kind of throw some things out here for you, specifically related to God and science today. But then I'd love to just, what are your questions? Because I know you guys are having interaction with folks, and you have questions in your own life. So I want to leave as much time as possible for that, okay? Let's see. So you might be wondering, what is apologetics? It comes from this Greek word, apologia, which you find in 1 Peter 3:15. 1 Peter 3:15 just says, basically, Peter implores us to be prepared to give the reason for the hope that we have within us. And that little word reason in the Greek is apologia. It's where this word apologetics comes from. And so the way that I think about apologetics is basically helping others to see 2 things. That Christianity is true to the way the world is, and that it's also true to the way the world ought to be. Okay, do you guys hear the difference? In other words, it's true, but it's also satisfying. And the really cool thing about Christianity is no matter who we are, what I find, and this is how C.S. Lewis puts it, but Christianity is this perfect blend of what Lewis would call reason and romance. So romance is that part of us that longs for a certain kind of world. And of course, reason is that part of us that is seeking truth. And Christianity is this perfect blend. And I actually want to bring that out here. We're going to talk about science, but we're really going to be talking about the beauty of the gospel as both reasonable and desirable, okay? So that's a little bit of, and so again, you guys can ask a lot of questions, but I'm going to throw some stuff out there to get you thinking here. So here's a question that I hear all the time. Does science somehow disprove God? There's books, bestsellers, New York Times bestsellers. I'm reading 2 right now that I can't keep up with them. They come out it seems like every month, basically arguing that, hey, science shows that there is no God. And so this is a very real question. But to think about it, or to get our minds on it, I want to start actually with the idea of a bicycle. And C.S. Lewis is one of my favorite sort of authors and writers, and there's this not very well-known essay that he wrote actually for a periodical in 1946 called An Essay on Bicycles. And in there, he was using the bicycle to illustrate basically the stages that we go through with respect to anything. Okay, so he's just using the bicycle, but it could be anything. And he says, well, consider the bicycle. When you are born into this world as a child, the bike, as well as all the other sort of human gadgets, mean nothing to us, right? We don't have any concepts for them. They don't mean anything. And he says that's the stage where we're just unenchanted toward the bike. But then he says early on, the child begins to gets old enough, and he starts to ride his bike with training wheels. You guys might remember this, or with your own children. And then there's that moment where, if you can remember in your own children's life, or even in your own life, that moment when the training wheels came off and you were riding that bike for the first time. And Lewis says at that moment, we enter the second stage towards the bike, which is it's enchanted. In other words, life is exactly as it should be, and you have a new freedom, and riding that bike brings joy and happiness and things like that. It's kind of like this is the way life is supposed to be. So the bike is this enchanted thing. But then, very quickly, at least it was for me, you enter the third stage, disenchantment. This is where the bike becomes work. I can remember as a kid, I rode my bike everywhere. and I hated it after a while because it was just tiring, It took forever and things like that. And so Lewis talks about how at this stage, he says, riding the bike becomes like a galley slave to the oar. It's work and things like that. And here's the interesting thing. Lewis says most of us stay in this third stage with pretty much everything. And he says we've got to move past this third stage to the fourth stage. And the fourth stage is basically re-enchanting. And what this means is we need to move on. So with respect to the bicycle, this is where we begin to enjoy the bicycle as gift and enjoy it in creaturely response, a gift from our Creator. And so he talks about these 4 stages of enchantment that we go through with pretty much everything. But he also, and this is the key point, he says most of us, though, get stuck in that third stage, disenchantment. And I want to suggest to you, and this is actually relevant for this discussion about science, is that we live in an age of disenchantment. And what I mean by that is we no longer, as a culture, see things in their proper light, right? So if you think about our culture, they view everything as ordinary. Everything is ordinary or mundane. It's everyday. But in reality, the world is not ordinary or mundane, right? It's deeply beautiful. It's deeply mysterious. It's actually deeply God-bathed or enchanted, okay? And so we live in a disenchanted age, and so we actually don't see the world in its proper light as gift from God to enjoy in creaturely response, okay? So here's the question I want us to focus on then. Given that we live in a disenchanted age, what is the message that we're told science gives us? And how does disenchantment actually affect the way we see the world and affect the way we do science, okay? That's what I want to explore with you here. And so let's look a little bit. Okay, let me back up. So let me give you one word. I promise not to bore you with, philosophy, but there's this question of how do we get knowledge in our culture? And the main answer to that question, how do we get knowledge, is this word. It's called scientism. It's a fancy word, and all it means is this. All knowledge comes from science. So if you want knowledge, go to the man or the woman in the white lab coat, surrounded by pretty sophisticated apparatus of tools and things like that. Don't go to pastors. Don't go to theologians. Go to the man or the woman in the lab coat. Okay, it's called scientism. Now here's the interesting thing. So this is your dominant theory of knowledge in our world today. And a lot of times, from that theory of knowledge, they'll make a jump to conclusions about reality itself. So that's, and the jump is, well, we can't detect God, therefore there is no God, okay? So here's one example. This is a quote from a guy named Alex Rosenberg. Alex Rosenberg is the chair of Duke University's philosophy department, and he wrote a book in 2011 called An Atheist's Guide to Reality. And so this is what he says in the second chapter, but I want you to just notice the theory of knowledge here and what it entails. He says, if we're going to be scientistic, then we have to attain our view of reality from what physics tells us about it. Actually, we'll have to do more than that. We'll have to embrace physics as the whole truth about reality. Do you guys hear the scientism here? Why? By the picture of reality that physics paints? Well, it's simple, really. We trust science as the only way to acquire knowledge. It's a very clear statement of scientism. But notice what it entails. That is why we are so confident about atheism. So there's this claim, hey, all knowledge comes from science, and therefore, atheism is true, okay? So this is a pretty standard kind of motif. Just to give you more then, like I said, the name of this book that Alex wrote is called An Atheist's Guide to Reality. And so right in the preface, he gives kind of your Gettysburg Address then. Okay, given that science tells us there is no God, what does science tell us about all the perennial questions in life that we all ask? Okay, you ready? Here's the answer. There's Alex. There's the book. Okay, and this is right from his book. He's going to go through all these perennial questions that we all want answers to, and he's going to give us the answer that science supposedly gives. Okay, is there God? No. What is the nature of reality? Whatever physics says it is. What is the purpose of the universe? There is none. What is the meaning of life? Ditto. No meaning. Why am I here? Just dumb luck. Does prayer work? Of course not. There's no God. Is there a soul? Is it immortal? Are you kidding? That's just wildly implausible today. Is there free will? Not a chance. It's trying to be funny there if you can follow that. There's no free will. It's all determined. So there's no chance. What happens when we die? Pretty much everything goes on as before, except not with you. It's kind of depressing, isn't it? Here you go. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference. This is what science tells us, supposedly. Why should you be moral then? Because it makes you feel good. So go for it. Is abortion, euthanasia, suicide, paying taxes, foreign aid, or anything you don't like forbidden, permissible, or obligatory? Anything goes. If there is no God, anything is permissible. Okay, here's one. If you might be wondering, what is love? Okay, you ready? Love is a solution to a strategic interaction problem. Don't look for it, it'll find you when you need it. There you go. No, that's not love, is it? But that's what science tells us. Does history have any meaning or purpose? It's full of sound and fury, but signifies nothing. And does the human past have any lessons for our future? Fewer and fewer, if it ever had any. Okay, so the list, you kind of get the picture, right? Now there's lots that we could say about this, but I just want to say two things, and these are going to be pretty obvious. The first thing I want to say is this. Hey, if that's what atheism is, that's just a bad story, right? It's a life without God, without meaning, without purpose, without morality. And it's interesting. So there were I think Alex is a clear-eyed atheist. There was one of my favorite clear-eyed atheists was a guy named Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell lived a long life. He was born in 1872. He died in 1970. So you think of all the history that he saw. He was a Brit. But in the 1920s, he wrote a book called Why I Am Not a Christian. So he's kind of like, before there was Richard Dawkins, if you know who that is, and the God Delusion and all the new atheists, if you know who they are, there was Bertrand Russell. In this book that he wrote, Why I Am Not a Christian, he was a philosopher, he has a chapter in there called A Free Man's Worship. And in there he says this, and I think this is very clear-eyed if atheism is true. He said, if we are just the co-location of atoms, then all we can do is build our life on the firm foundation of unyielding despair. Think about that. If we're just the accidental co-location of atoms, then we should build our life on the firm foundation of despair. I think he's a very clear-eyed atheist. If you read this book, you want to know what he says? He says, look, if you don't like this, well, you can take drugs. Literally, that's the answer. He means Paxil and antidepressants and whatever. That's it? That's the best we can do, is take drugs? That's a bad story. I want to come back to that at the end. That actually matters, okay? Second thing, though, I think we want to notice, this scientism, this idea about knowledge only comes from science, two things you need to know about it. It's overly restrictive, and it's self-refuting. Okay, I'm going to go back, see if I can go back. See if somebody can tell me. Here's the claim. Science is the only way to acquire knowledge. Does anybody notice anything about that claim? What do you notice about it? Yeah, go ahead.
It's very intolerant.
Okay, yeah, it is intolerant, because what if you want to know things from other sources? If I say every English sentence is 3 words long, is that a true statement? Right, why? Why? Because in the uttering of the sentence itself, I'm refuting myself, right? It's a self-refuting sentence. So too with this. In the same way that every English word is 3 words long, sentence is 3 words long, is self-refuting, this is self-refuting. It says all knowledge comes from science. Now, is that claim, which is a claim to knowledge, does that claim come from science? The answer is no. It comes from philosophy. It's a theory of knowledge called scientism. So it's actually a self-refuting statement if you can follow that, okay? Okay, if you can't follow that, that's okay. Let's go back to it's overly restrictive. Let's come on back here. So how's it overly restrictive? Well, because there's tons of things we know, and we don't know them from science. Think about history. Does science tell us that Abraham Lincoln lived? No, it's historical knowledge. It's a different kind of knowledge. Think about mathematical knowledge. My kids are struggling through, well, depending on their grade. We've got 5th graders, 10th graders, 11th graders, and 12th graders are struggling through geometry and algebra and calculus and decimals, And that's not science. That's mathematical knowledge. So 2 + 2 = 4. I don't need science for that. Theology. We think that religious claims are knowledge claims, right? Do we go to the scientist to tell us, whether John 3:16 is a statement of limited atonement or not? No, right? There's theological knowledge that's not scientific. You guys get the point, right? We could go on and on and on. Honesty is a virtue. That's a fact. I think that's a piece of knowledge we have. Do we go to science for that? No, that's a moral bit of knowledge that we know, and we have because we have moral faculties. Okay, the point is we know tons of things that don't come from science. So don't let yourselves get beat into this idea that all knowledge, or even the best knowledge, comes from science. That's not the case. All right, you with me? You okay? Okay, I need feedback. James knows from my students here. All right, just in case you think I'm making this up and picking on one guy, let me just quickly catalog some of the leading voices. This guy's name is Sean Carroll, a very important theoretical physicist from California Institute of Technology. I'm actually reading his most recent book right now. It's in my bag, called The Big Picture. The explanation for the origin of the universe, life, and meaning. And guess what the answer is? The answer is there is no God, and it's exactly this kind of thing. So here's what he says. Conventional scientific progress will ultimately result in a self-contained understanding of the origin of and evolution of the universe with no need to invoke God. Okay? Next guy. Victor Stenger. He just passed away. He was a philosopher and a physicist, taught at the University of Hawaii. He's one of these so-called new atheists. If you don't know what that is, we can talk about it later if you'd like. But this is what he said in one of his books. He basically thinks that the absence of evidence for God is evidence of the absence of God, if you followed that that sentence. But he says here in his book, the Failed Hypothesis, hey, you have no evidence for Bigfoot, abominable snowman, and the Loch Ness Monster, so we don't believe they exist. Well, if you have no evidence or reason for believing in God, well, then we can be pretty sure that God doesn't exist either, okay? You guys might know this guy, Stephen Hawking. His most recent book was actually 2010. He co-wrote it with a guy named Leonard Mlodinow. It's called The Grand Design. Very interesting book. In there he says this, which as a philosopher hurts. Philosophy is dead. Philosophy is not kept up with modern developments in science. Hopefully you can hear the scientism here, particularly physics. Scientists have become the new bearers of torch in the discovery of our quest for knowledge. And by the way, if you read the book, the whole entire last half of the book is really bad philosophy, where he argues for things like the universe brings itself into existence, which is actually a logically incoherent statement. But that's Stephen Hawking's. You guys know Richard Dawkins? He wrote The God Delusion and other books. But in this particular quote, there's a familiar sort of thing that's thrown out there that, hey, if we appeal to God, we're going to be science stoppers, because we're being lazy. We're not, following the evidence. And so he says, if you don't want to understand something or how it works, never mind. Just give up and say God did it. Please don't go to work on the problem. Just give up and appeal to God. Can you hear the sarcasm in his voice here? Dear scientists, don't work on your mysteries. Bring us your mysteries, for we can use them. Don't squander precious ignorance by researching it away. We need your glorious gaps as a last refuge for God. Okay? And I could go on and on and on, actually, but you get the picture, right? Okay, there's this common claim that is out there that somehow science disproves that God exists. Okay, so what do we do about this? Let me just say a few things. I'm going to actually show you how we should actually understand science. I just want to say that science has its limits, or I want to point that out. We've already kind of done that. Science makes all these assumptions that are not itself scientific. It assumes things like the world is objective, and that we can actually have knowledge of the world. It assumes that our language actually hooks up to the world in a kind of correspondence relationship between our language and our theories and the way the world is. It assumes all these things. It assumes that nature is uniform, so that when we make inferences, things in the past will be the same in the future. These are all assumptions that don't come from science, strictly speaking. They're actually philosophical assumptions you bring to science. Okay? And then again, just the idea that there's knowledge from other sources. So the big point here is that science tells us the limits of nature, but it doesn't tell us whether there's anything beyond those limits. Okay? This is from a philosopher friend of mine, Tim McGrew. All right, so that's all just sort of set up to get, I guess, whet your appetite. What do we do then? How do we understand science? I want to actually show you the good news here now. And the good news is that science actually is incredible an incredible tool to show that God exists. And not just that, it actually reveals a deeply meaningful world and a story that is alive and that understands you, namely the gospel. So let me try to unpack that, okay? So let me just set it up with a few questions. So how does science support God? Because I want to show you how it does. But we need to understand how it works, okay? So I'm going to say a sentence, and then I just want to make sure you hear what I'm saying. So how does science support God? Science provides evidence in support of a philosophical premise in an argument that has a theological conclusion. Okay, I'm going to say that again so you can kind of follow this. Okay, how does science support God? Science provides evidence for a philosophical premise in an argument that has a theological conclusion. I'm going to show you that now, okay, but I just want you to hear that, okay? Second question, how do we generate an argument using science? Well, this is very simple. We walk around this world that God has made, and we pick anything, and we plug it into a premise in an argument with a theological conclusion, okay? So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to show you how this works now, and I'm going to pick the universe itself. But we could pick anything in the universe and do the same kind of thing. There's so many amazing arguments out there. In fact, the way that I view this is I think there's daily 1 million clues that point to God if we have eyes to see. Okay? That's the part of re-enchanting the world. We need to have eyes to see. But let me just show you by picking the universe itself. Okay? So here's the argument. I'm going to just throw it up here. It's a famous argument that's been debated and discussed for actually 2,000 years. It's called the Kalam cosmological argument. But it basically goes like this. I'm gonna chart it out another way here too. So like I said, you begin with the universe. Let's try this. And then we're just going to ask a series of questions. I've actually sat in dorm dining halls and mapped this out on napkins with students. It's easy to map out. So we're going to begin with the universe itself, and we're going to ask a few questions about it. And we've formalized it in an argument, but basically it kind of goes like this. Either the universe began, or it didn't begin. If the universe began, it was either caused or it was not caused. And then, so there's our decision tree. And really, well, we do think the universe exists, but we're going to argue that it began. That's going to be formalized in our second premise here, the universe began. And then the conclusion will be the universe had a cause. And I'm going to show you how this is actually a theological conclusion. Okay? Are you guys with me so far? Okay. So the question, how does science actually support belief in God? Remember, science provides evidence for a philosophical premise in an argument with a theological conclusion. So what's the premise that we're going to use science in? It's going to be premise number 2. The universe began to exist. Okay? Let me give you 2 interesting pieces of evidence. I'm just going to talk it out. I can go deeper if you'd like, but I'm just going to kind of informally talk it out and let you see how the science works, okay? And I'm going to skip all this. Premise 1, there's lots of good reasons to believe in it, but let's just start here. Why do we think the universe began? Well, here's 2 things from science. The first piece of evidence from science is the idea that the universe is expanding, okay? Now, here's some interesting facts. Prior to about 1917, the dominant view by most scientists was that the universe was eternal. And by that, I mean that it existed forever and that it was static, okay? That was pretty much the dominant view. And then you had Einstein. And it started to kind of crumble in 1905 when he developed his special theory of relativity. And then in 1917, he develops his field equations for what's called the general theory of relativity. And in there, he noticed something kind of weird. He noticed that his field equations implied that the universe was actually not static, that it was expanding. Implication being if it's expanding like this, out in space over time, that if you go back, the implication is you go back to a point of origin. And so what Einstein did in 1917 is he put what's called a fudge factor in his equations to get rid of the expansion, because that would be something new, and he was uncomfortable with the implications. But then you have 1929. So has anybody been to Mount Wilson telescope in LA, in Los Angeles? Do you know about this? Okay, well, if you go to Los Angeles, there's a Mount Wilson Observatory. It's a telescope there, and In 1929, Edwin Hubble, this is his name, he was staring up into the telescope in the night sky. And what Hubble discovered is this first thing called redshift, okay? And this was the first sort of empirical discovery that confirmed the universe is expanding. Okay, so you might ask, what is redshift? I think I can do this simply. Let me try. So you know that light travels in waves, right? It arrives with wavelengths to us. So there's a visible range where we can see light. So when the light source, let's say this is a flashlight, and if the light source is moving toward me, the waves are going to shrink. They're going to compress, okay? And that means that they're going to get shorter. And they shift to what's called the blue end of the visible spectrum. So it has blue shift, okay? If my light source, let's call it a flashlight, is moving away from me, the waves are going to get longer. And that's going to, in other words, they're going to shift to the red end of the spectrum. So it's called redshift. So imagine Edwin Hubble looking up in the night sky in 1929, looking in his telescope, and what does he see from the starlight that's coming to him in the universe? He notices they're all shifted to the red end of the spectrum. What does that tell you? It's expanding away. The universe is expanding. So that was the first piece of empirical evidence that the universe is not static. And today it's been confirmed over and over and over again. So everybody thinks now the universe is expanding. Okay, so it became in the 1940s what is now called the standard Big Bang model. And the standard Big Bang model basically says, hey, if you go back in time, it's called the singularity, but there's a time, a finite time ago, when literally nothing exists. And then at that moment of the Big Bang, listen to this, all time, matter, energy, and space came into existence. And I'm thinking, doesn't that just sound like Genesis 1:1, you know? But this is Big Bang cosmology. It's from science. The second thing, that MBR, stands for microwave background radiation. This is interesting too. You have theoretical physicists now that are saying, okay, if the Big Bang, if there was a moment when everything sprang into existence out of nothing, literally, which is kind of cool, we would expect the heat signature from that big explosion to sort of permeate the entire universe. And so in 1946, a guy named George Gamow, again, these are details, I can point you to books if you'd like, in purely theoretical reasons, he said, okay, if the universe began a finite time ago, we would expect the microwave background radiation to permeate the universe at this specific wavelength or temperature. And he made a prediction. What's interesting, 1965, a couple guys in Bell Laboratory discovered the microwave background radiation exactly as it was predicted, at the exact wavelength and frequency and temperature as was predicted by Gamow. And since then, it's been confirmed again over and over again by satellites that we send up into space that measure in all directions the kind of energy that we see in the universe. And so here you have two pieces of information that basically confirm something that we have been saying all along, that the universe began a finite time ago, okay? So you guys see how science is supporting a premise? That's one piece. There's another piece of evidence from science, and it's something that if you can remember your high school or your kids' high school, the second law of thermodynamics. Does anybody remember what that is? Do you know what that is? Do you guys remember? No? Okay, you haven't got there. What grade are you guys in? You never shut up. You're in college. You should remember this. Okay, it's okay. All right, so second law of thermodynamics basically says in a closed system, you can say it a number of ways, but in a closed system, the amount of usable energy decreases, okay? It looks something like this. Another way to say it is in a closed system, the amount of entropy increases. Entropy is a word for usable energy. And so, let me give you some examples. So you guys have a gym in here somewhere? No? Okay, well, pretend that you're sitting outside this hall and you see a red kickball bouncing in that little nice area down below here. What would you infer about that kickball? Would you think that it's been bouncing for eternity? It's just making its way through your quarter? Yeah, you'd look for the kid, right, that kicked that thing. Why? Because the ball has not reached what's called equilibrium yet. Its usable energy has not run down, right? So that's Super Bowl. Think of, let's switch the analogy. Suppose you walked in here tonight and there's a hot cup of Starbucks coffee right on the table. Would you infer that that hot cup of Starbucks coffee has been here for eternity? No. What would you infer? Somebody just put it there. Right, because it still has usable energy. It hasn't run down yet. Okay, so think of the universe like a big coffee cup. It's still hot. There's still usable energy. But here's the thing. If the universe is eternal, it would have already reached what's called equilibrium. But it's not. If this is usable energy, we have plenty of it. Think of all those stars. It's energy. So the fact that we haven't run down is scientific evidence to show that the universe began, which is, again, support for that premise in that argument. Okay? Yeah?
Okay, but that's assuming that the universe is a closed.
That's right. That's right.
But is it?
Well, there's debate on that, actually. Now, according to the naturalist, it's a closed system. There's nothing outside it. Now, we would actually want to say it's sort of open because there's other causal influences. But but the material cosmos, think of the material universe. Most people say it's a closed physical system. Now, we as theists will say, well, God can actually interact within that system. But yeah, that's a great question. Okay, anything else? Just want to kind of show you how the science actually works. I'm actually teaching a whole class this semester on, it's a faith and science class, and we're going through 4 origin debates. So this is kind of these key debates that are so controversial in our culture, the origin of the universe, and this is a great example of why science actually supports that the universe began. And then we're looking at the origin of life, we just finished that, and the origin of species, so talk Darwin, and then of course the origin of humans, which is one that we're interested in too. So it's been a lot of fun. The evidence is amazing. Science is on our side, and that's exactly as it should be if God is the creator of all things, right? Okay, so back to the argument. Just so you can see it again. So I gave you 2 pieces of evidence from science that function as support for a premise. The universe began to exist, in an argument that has a theological conclusion. So why does this argument have a theological conclusion? Well, here's why. Okay, what's the nature of this cause? So I erased it. Okay, so if that argument is sound, we've learned that the universe is basically ontologically haunted, is the way I like to say it. There's something that's mysteriously beyond the universe, but somehow the cause of the universe. And that would obviously cause people to pause. The reason why I love this argument is because it rules out everything but theism pretty quickly, because now we have a cause. Okay, what do we learn about the nature of that cause, though? Well, we learn quite a bit. We learn that this cause of the universe must be personal, and here's why. There's basically 2 kinds of causes, and again, I'm trying to just keep this informal. There's something called event causation, and there's something called agent causation, okay? So there's only 2 kinds of causes. Event causation is kind of like, think of your dominoes, set up a bunch of dominoes, you have one event that causes another one in a chain of events. So it's called state-to-state causation. Prior state causes another state, okay? And then the other one, agent causation, you have an agent that is the first cause of some event. Now, go back to the singularity. According to the model, there's no prior state. There's nothing on the other side of the Big Bang. So that rules out event causation. There's only one other kind of causation, namely agent causation. So right now we know the cause of the universe is personal. Isn't that cool? Theism, right there on the table. But more than that. We can argue that this cause that we just learned is a personal cause is uncaused. Why? Because if this personal cause was caused, it too would need a cause of its existence, but you can't go all the way back in infinity of causes because then you never get to this universe. So it must be uncaused. It must be necessary. All that means is that we're all contingent beings. We come into being, but we didn't have to if our parents never met. We wouldn't exist, That's what it means to be contingent. Well, God is not. This cause is not like that. This cause is necessary. It cannot not exist. Why? We'll get to in a minute. It must be immaterial because, remember, matter comes into existence at the moment of the origin of the Big Bang. So whatever caused it can't be material. Isn't this interesting? It's starting to sound a lot like the God of the Bible. It must be eternal because it's uncaused and only things that come into being since it's uncaused, it doesn't have, it's always existed. Enormously powerful, right? We don't know if it's all powerful, at least from this argument, But think about the world that it's brought into being. It's an incredible world. So whatever this causes must be enormously powerful, incredibly intelligent. If you think about the incredible fit and fine-tuning, which is another argument from science that comes into the world. And then finally, we can argue that this cause must be one because we live in a universe, not a plural verse. And you don't multiply causes typically beyond what's necessary. And a singular cause like this is sufficient. So again, these are things we learn by just examining the nature of the argument, that little simple argument there. And this isn't the God of Isaac, Abraham, Jacob, and Jesus yet, but it's certainly consistent with it, right? It's ruled out naturalism. It's ruled out all the Eastern religions. You're in theism pretty squarely here, okay? That's an example of how science, does that make sense? Do you kind of see? I just want you to see this. All right. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Explain theism, just so that
Okay.
everybody understands.
Yeah, theism is just a broad term that describes the great, it's a belief in a personal God, and so you have monotheism, and there's three great monotheistic religions. There's Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And what's interesting, that argument was originally advanced in the 3rd century by Christian philosophers. It was lost to the Christian West and picked up by the Muslims for about 3 centuries. And then it was delivered back to the Christian West with Aquinas and beyond, and some others beyond. And so Muslims and Jews and Christians have argued this argument for 2,000 years. And that's why I use the word theism sometimes. So it's consistent with the God of the Bible. But we're not reading about Jesus here through nature, Okay, good question. Anything else? All right, let me just wrap up, and then I just want to open up because I'm just showing you one thing, but there's so many questions that you might have here. Okay, let me just go back. Remember the idea that the story that Alex Rosenberg gave us about science is a bad story? Well, there's this question, what is the story that the cosmos is telling us? What is the meaning of the universe? Because I actually think that this is the stage that God has set for us, for the one story that understands us. And so if I could, I want to just end this piece, and then we'll talk with one of my other favorite authors. Anybody? Well, you know who that is. It's Tolkien. J.R. Tolkien, the guy who wrote Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and all that stuff. He was, of course, a good friend of Lewis. And while he was writing the Lord of the Rings, he wrote an essay called An Essay on Fairy Story. Has anybody read this? I would doubt it. It's kind of a hard essay. But it's actually a really, really important essay, I think, for what I want you to hear tonight. In this essay, what's interesting is Lewis and Tolkien actually have a theology of fairy stories. Like, they're writing about Narnia or Middle-earth with an agenda. It's kind of interesting. And he unpacks some of this in this essay. It's called An Essay on Fairy Story. But I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes because I think will summarize what I want you to hear here. He says 3 things in this essay. The first thing he says is he makes a distinction between what he calls primary belief and secondary belief. And you guys know what this phenomenon is. He says when you read good fiction or when you watch a movie, and maybe in our case, you know it's fiction, but it's done so well that you actually enter into the story. You guys relate to this, right? You enter into the secondary world. And so when the hero escapes death, we feel with the hero, right? There's joy. When the lovers finally get together, there's joy that it worked out and things like that. And so we actually enter into the secondary world, and he calls that secondary belief, okay? That's the first thing he says. Second thing Tolkien says, though, is this. He says there's a kind of story that we all long for, every one of us. And he says the kind of story that we all long for has 5 characteristics. Okay, listen to the 5 characteristics. He says we long for a world that is a supernatural. He actually said a magical world, even a supernatural world, number 1. A world where love is eternal. A world where victory is snatched out of the hands of defeat. A world where death is cheated. And then finally, a happy ending. Okay, he says we all long for that kind of a world. That's why they like to do fairy stories. Okay, that's the second thing he says. The third thing he says is he asks this question. He says, why do we long for that kind of story? Because he says, we know at the fact level that often evil does triumph over good. We know that life is temporally bound. And the modern intelligentsia tell us there is no supernatural, magical world. But he's asking this question, why do we long for that kind of story? And the answer that he says is really interesting. He says we long for this kind of story because, and he's talking about fairy stories, but I think it's any good story, really. These fairy stories point to an underlying reality that is actually more real than the primary world of our experience. Think about that. Why do we long for these stories? Because they point to an underlying reality that's more real than the primary world of our experience. And I don't think I have it in my notes, but in this essay, I don't have it, but he talks about how these stories awaken longing. He says, what the primary purpose of these stories is desirability. Why do you want to go to Middle-earth if you're a Tolkien fan? I don't know if there's any Tolkien fans. For me, it's Narnia. Why do you want to always go back to Narnia? Because they awaken within us a longing for another world. And why are they doing this? Because they want to awaken within us the longing for the only other world we'll ever go to, which is the kingdom of God. It's brilliant, actually. Okay? And this is in the epilogue of this essay, Tolkien says, well, what about the gospel itself? Is the gospel just one more good story that points to some deeper reality? And here, in Tolkien's brilliance, he says, no, the gospel isn't one more story that points to a deeper reality. He says in the gospel, you get the point of story itself. And what's the point of story? Well, it's Jesus. Jesus is the point of all good stories. And this is why I love at the college, we have this great books program, and we read Homer and all the great books. And you see the voice of God in these stories. All of them, I think. Jesus is the point of all good stories. This is what Tolkien says. And he says, because Jesus actually, because of the resurrection, he says Jesus punctures this hole between the way the world is and the way the world ought to be. And so in the gospel, here's the key difference. We don't have to sort of put down our book, put down our Bible, and walk into the real world. In the gospel, we're actually experiencing and in the story that's actually alive and understands you. And so this is what I want to push when we think about science, is these two questions. Is there a story that understands you, right? There's all these competing stories. Is that story that the atheist is telling us, science delivers, does that story understand you? No way, right? Is this story alive, right? We know the story that's alive and understands us. It's the gospel. And what is the cosmos? The cosmos is the stage for the story of God. There's meaning in everything in the cosmos if we would have eyes to see. And so part of what I want to encourage you with science, well, part of the problem that we're having with science is that we don't see the world the way that it actually is. And we need, and Tolkien talks about, sometimes escape is heroic. That's why we enter Middle-earth. He says we enter it because we come back with recovery. And I'm suggesting that we need to begin to see the world in its proper light, and then we'll see how science actually does point to God. So anyway, I think that's all I got. Yeah, that's all I got. So, okay, so it looks like we have maybe not as much time as I hoped, but I'd love to what are your questions about this or science? There's so much. So this is our opportunity to talk about that. Go ahead.
Are you talking about the kingdom of God?
For what?
Well, the universe.
Uh-huh. The physical universe?
Why did you do that?
I'm sorry, say it one more time.
Could you relate this universe to the kingdom of God?
I think that's a great question. The kingdom of God is the rule and the reign of God, which of course encompasses on earth in history, right? And so we're living in a specific age, the church age, sometimes people call it. And so how do I relate it? Well, this is the stage in which God is enacting his rule and his reign.
Well, don't you think that Jesus was living in the kingdom of God in his own thought? Well, why are you afraid? Or what? He walked on the water. Well, come on, you can do that too.
Yeah. Yeah, I depending on what you mean, yes.
It was way above us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But maybe that's what we need to work up to.
Right. Yeah, and so I'm actually writing a book on this right now, and the thing that I'm arguing for is we need to learn to see the world the way Jesus sees and delights in the world. And if you read the Gospels, for Jesus, the world is a God-bathed world. Jesus is ever present. I'm sorry, God is everywhere present. It's not an empty universe. I think this is what you mean. Yeah, it's everywhere. And so my plea is that we need to begin to see the world the same way Jesus does and delight in it. And then we need to invite others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. So yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. Yes, absolutely. Yep. Good. Yeah.
There's quite a few books, I guess by scientists,
Yep.
some of them Christian, some of them not, over the last few years about this design,
Mm-hmm.
argument from design.
Yep.
I think some of them are Christian, some of them are not. Should generally Christians see that as what's their relationship to all that?
Yeah.
Is it a good thing?
It is a good thing. Yeah, the books are mostly written by Christians, arguing, hey, there's actually empirical criterion that we can identify in science that point to an intelligent designer. And so these are good things that I think that we should become conversant in. If you're interested in a really good accessible one, there's one that was just written last year by a guy named Doug Axe, A-X-E, called Undeniable. The most accessible book, understanding how, and he does a great case of arguing, natural selection it's an aimless wanderer, and we can't get the kind of complexity that we have in a life through naturalistic evolution, selection. And so yeah, these are good things. These are people that are arguing that Darwinian mechanisms aren't sufficient for life and the complexity of life that we find. So yeah, read them.
Did you like Lee Strobel's work?
Yeah, the Case for Faith, Case for Christ, it's excellent. Yeah, and the thing I like about his work is that he interviews the leading Christian scholars on all these areas. So there'll be a chapter in there on a couple chapters actually on science and Case for Faith that I'd highly recommend. Yeah, good. Yeah, go ahead.
Where does science end and faith begin?
What do you mean by faith?
Well, that's a belief we have, or a feeling, I guess, or
Okay.
idea, or an attitude, or a philosophy.
Okay. The reason why I asked is because we're very confused as a culture about what faith is. Faith is not a blind leap in the dark. It's never been, biblically. Faith is not something that we do that is against evidence. Faith, biblically, is ventured trust. So your question is interesting because we all place our faith, we all have ventured trust in something, right? And so as Christians, the object of our faith is Christ for salvation. And then, there's a whole package that comes with the gospel that we place our faith in. And so that's why I wanted to ask. It's hard for me to answer that because I don't view faith as there's a cognitive component where we're venturing trust in something that's we have good reasons to believe. So I would say it takes more faith to be an atheist than to be a theist because you have to believe things that we have no evidence for. Does that help a little bit? I don't know if that helps at all.
Scientists, they only have faith in themselves. They only believe what
Yeah.
they can prove.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So they have a faith. They have a ventured trust in themselves, maybe in the scientific method. And the question is are those objects worthy objects of our trust? And that's where apologetics comes in. Is that really the thing that's going to sustain your life? And the answer is, I think, is no. Okay, anything else?
I love the way you phrase that. Is there a story that understands that?
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that some more. What does that?
Yeah.
How is atheism not a story that understands it? How is
The gospel. Mm-hmm.
a story that understands it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way that I have started to view, I do a lot of traveling and speaking on college campuses, and I used to just be like, if they asked me to talk on, next week I'm going to share about the problem of evil. Why does God allow pain and suffering? And I used to just give there's standard moves that philosophers and theologians make. But I've stopped doing that because I've realized that question presupposes there's intuitions that drive these questions. And so what I've come to do is I realize that there's all these competing stories that are out there in culture, and each of those stories is vying for your allegiance and participation, right? And this is how I tell students now, of all the competing stories that are out there, which one actually understands you? I gave you a snapshot of atheism. That's a story. And it begins with matter, and then it goes to ignorance, and then ends with progress. And that's somehow supposed to be the story arc of it. And I say to you, a story like that, or even that stuff I cataloged earlier, does that really satisfy? Does that really satisfy the longings of our heart? Because remember, we want in apologetics to show that Christianity is true to the way the world is, and true to the way the world ought to be. And that's what I think these questions bring out. We long for a world where things are right. It's called shalom in Scripture, or the Hebrew word is shalom. It's the picture you see in Genesis 1 or Revelation 22, where everything is it ought to be. Well, that's the gospel story, right? That's moving toward full restoration and shalom and all that. But sin is a violation of shalom. It's a vandalism of shalom. So we don't live in a world. This is what we'll talk about next week. I don't know. I feel like I'm wandering. Is that a little bit? Okay.
And for those of you that were here when we talked about the three circles approach to sharing the gospel, that it begins with God's good design and then moves to that circle of brokenness. And what is the explanation for the brokenness?
That's right.
In the world? And I think that's what he's talking about here is that the biblical explanation for the universe and for life is reasonable, much more reasonable, because it gives an explanation for the brokenness, but it also gives the solution for the brokenness.
That's right. Yeah, so the gospel correctly diagnoses the problem and offers a solution. Science diagnoses the problem as ignorance and offers a solution, usually of technology. Actually, usually the problem's pain. We'll talk about this next, And so what do? We need to avoid pain. That's our biggest problem. And usually the savior becomes technology in science, or Paxil drugs, if that doesn't work. So there and then there. Is there a Big Bang moment in God's creation? I think that the standard Big Bang model which is kind of the reigning view right now, sounds to me an awful lot like the Christian doctrine of creation. Out of nothing, God created the universe. And that's pretty neat that science confirms exactly what we would say in Genesis 1. Yeah. How about back there, and then we'll go there.
Wondering, so if you were talking to someone who comes from a background of Hinduism, Buddhism, or Taoism, and they have this concept of the universe as a place that is cyclical and is continuously kind of renewing itself, the idea of reincarnation,
Yeah.
and then you have evidences in science, the natural world, the water cycle, the rock cycle, all these different cyclical things. How would you help them to understand that, the argument, I'm really interested in your argument, and I'm trying to figure out what's the evidence for the fact that never mind, I guess you said with the redshift that without this empirical evidence, that there was
That's right.
a beginning, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And
Yeah.
so that kind of refutes the idea that it was an eternal,
Yeah.
cyclical thing, and there had to be a beginning.
That's right. Yeah, there's more to be said, but that's the essence of what I said there is what I would say. And that's just what the science shows us. Now, I'm giving you the science in support of that premise. There's actually two pretty interesting philosophical reasons to think that the universe began too. I don't want to give you those here, but so there's lots that can be said in support of that premise. Usually I start with science because we all like that and we can get that. Yeah, so go ahead.
I remember you were talking about there were 5 different aspects of the story that
Yep.
you all really want to hear,
Mhm.
and the gospel fulfills all of those 5.
Yep.
How are you supposed to convince and explain that to a person who becomes skeptical of such things because they've been jaded by that same
That's
story
right.
presented in the media?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is the question I'm actually wrestling in this book that I'm writing. And I think it has to begin with awakening longing. And so I'm going to say more than you might have. You're yes, and so how are we doing here? You guys need to be out in 3 minutes. I can do this in 1. I'll try. And just wait for the book. for the rest. I think that to build bridges to the gospel, we want to look at our Athens. I'm thinking of Paul and Mars Hill here. He identified a key starting point, and then he builds bridges to the gospel, Jesus and the gospel. And if we had more time, I'd unpack that. But for us, what are the starting points? I think I want to identify universal human longings, and I'm looking at 3. Our longing for truth, our longing for goodness, and our longing for beauty. And what's interesting is that, so there's a philosopher that says that God has given us 3 profits of the human soul. He's given us our minds, so reason, and reason is on a quest for for truth, right? So it's on the quest for the object of its longing, which is truth. God has given us a conscience, and it's on a quest for goodness. And God has given us the imagination, and it's on a quest for beauty. And what's cool is goodness, truth, and beauty all find their source in Christ, right? And so if we can awaken longing through reason, the conscience, and imagination, we can build bridges to Jesus and the gospel. And so I think that we have way underutilized the imagination. And so beauty plays a huge role in people's lives in this culture. How can we tell stories that are actually better than the ones that they're telling here? How can we do videos and spoken word poetry and movies and all that stuff that's awakening longing? So anyway, I don't know if I'm trying to press on time, but does that help a little bit? I think we have to awaken people's longings. They're not even aware of what they're missing. And we do that by awakening their minds, awakening their longings for goodness, and awakening their longings for beauty. And some of that doesn't even have to be strictly religious at first, because we're just awakening. And then we could help them as evangelists and apologists along the way. Great question. Sorry, I know you guys need to get out. So next week we'll talk about something else, so we can keep talking then. So.